about the differences between folk and popular culture, and more importantly, how popular culture is threatening folk culture around the world. Now, here you can see a picture of popular culture. You can see Disneyland in China, and that's our culture. And so, even though they may like this and they may welcome it, we do have to understand and recognize that this is our culture kind of invading into their culture. From last time, we talked about different aspects of folk culture. Now, folk culture is kind of an idea that's very foreign to many of us because we don't see it a lot, and we're kind of away from it. We're not exposed to what folk culture kind of looks like, and so we kind of need to take a look at the characteristics of it again. So bear with me, and if you didn't take these notes last time, make sure you get them down. When we talk about a folk culture, they tend to be very isolated, and whether geography isolates them or sometimes like the Amish, they isolate themselves. And so they may not let a lot of other people into their culture. They may have rigid rules and things like that where their people can't interact with the outside world or the people around them outside of their group. And so for one reason or another, they are pretty isolated, and that keeps them from changing a whole lot. And that's kind of what we need to think about a folk culture is. A folk culture just doesn't change very much. It doesn't change very much over time, whereas our culture is going to change very often. It tends to be very rigid and inflexible. It doesn't go by trends. If you go to a church that's more of a folk culture, they're going to be singing the songs that their ancestors sang 500 years ago or 100 years ago. Whereas if you were to go to, say, a non-denominational Christian church today, you might hear kind of like a rock and roll version of music, and that's kind of the opposite. One very big distinct aspect that's different between popular culture and folk culture is that folk culture tends to be reinforced by the adults of society. In popular culture, the kids, you guys, teenagers, people in their 20s and maybe early 30s, those are the ones in popular culture that are setting the culture. Hey, this is what's cool and this is what's not. But in folk culture, the adults are saying these are the things you can do, and these are the things you can't do. These are the things that are taboo, and these are the sociofacts. This is how you can act. This is what you can say. This is what you can do. This is what you cannot do. But in a folk culture, that is typically reinforced by the adults every generation. Another aspect of most folk cultures, I don't know if we'd say all folk cultures, but I'd say most folk cultures, is that folk cultures are going to they're going to limit the ability, like the social mobility of women in terms of being able to read, to work, to bring in money. Now, this isn't all folk cultures again, but many of them will. And they tend to give women a domestic role where their job is to raise children, and therefore they don't need a lot of education, and therefore they're dependent upon their males in their lives. And so whether that's their dad or their brothers or their husband, women tend to be very dependent in a folk culture. Remember, we said folk cultures tend to be very homogenous ethnically, and we mean maybe not just racially. I mean, that could definitely happen. But in terms of a language, you're going to see folk cultures with one language. You're going to see folk cultures with one religion, one set of artifacts, sociofacts, and mentefacts. And so, as compared to like, if we say like the American culture, well, there's a lot of, different languages that can be spoken, whether that's English or Spanish or even different dialects and versions of English. You might have kind of Ebonics or something like that from the African American community. We know that people in the South have different dialects of English that say things differently, different slangs. And so we're very heterogeneous, whereas folk cultures, there's one dialect. It's all very similar. Last week we talked about how, whereas popular culture tends to diffuse from expansion to fusion, movement of ideas, we typically see that the only way that folk culture diffuses is through relocation diffusion, people actually moving and taking their culture with them. We also said that folk culture, compared to popular culture, at least, impacts the environment very minimally. It's not that folk cultures don't impact the environment at all. It's just that popular culture does such damage in terms of things like fossil fuel use, the use of chemicals and pesticides and herbicides to farm. Whereas, like a folk culture, typically, if they're farming, they're doing things organically, and even people that slash and burn farm, they let the jungle regrow unless there's too many people in an area. And so, typically speaking, a folk culture does a lot less damage, not no damage, but a lot less than popular culture. All right, and then they also tend to be what we call adaptive to their environment instead of trying to modify or what we call maladaptive cultural traits in popular culture. If they're going to build a house, a folk culture is going to use the materials that are present in their environment. If they're going to live in a cold environment, they're going to build a house to deal with a cold environment. They're not going to build an adobe house that's flat. If it snows a lot, they're going to build their house based on the environment. Whereas popular culture tends to build their houses however the heck they want, because they have heating systems and cooling systems and drainage systems and things that kind of modify the environment or make it so the environment is less controlling of whatever it is that they're doing. Okay, so these are aspects of folk culture. So one of the things that your key, your guided reading questions are going to talk about and ask you about are folk housing styles. Now, if you go into the binder, you're going to find that there is on page 174, you can take a look at kind of some different types of folk housing styles, and then if you want to, you can also read about it in your textbook. You have some information on, let's see, for the 9th edition, you guys will be on page 120 to 124. So if you'd like to read about it on 120 to 124, it has some information on different folk housing. But I'm going to go through it and kind of make it concise for you. And I think these are probably the main folk housing styles that you would ever need to know about for the AP exam. All right, the first one, and probably the one that's easiest to identify, is the salt box house in New England. And here's what it looks like. The salt box house, as you can see, has a kind of an interesting looking roof line, and it's very pitched, which means that it's very steep. And the reason it's steep is because in New England they have very cold, snowy winters, and they don't want the snow to build up, and so the roofs are very pitched to get that snow off. The other thing that we kind of noticed there is that the front side of the house there is pointing to the south. And I know we can't really tell it's pointing to the south, but believe me, it is. And what they're trying to do there is to take advantage of what we call passive solar energy. And so in the wintertime, when it's cold, they want the sun shining into those windows as much as possible to heat their house. And it won't heat it a ton, but it'll heat it quite a bit. And then in the summertime, when the sun is back over towards the north side of the house where there's not as many windows, well, then the sun can't beat down on the house as much and shine in, and it'll actually keep the house a little bit cooler. So this is not by accident that they did this. They built the house in response to the environment. And again, that's what we see with folk housing styles, is that they tend to be adaptive to the environment instead of modifying the environment. You can also see the chimney in the middle. Of course, they're trying to warm the house in those cold New England winters. And sometimes you'll see a big enough salt box house to where they have a chimney on each end. But typically the living quarters are going to be in the bottom, and the kitchen and everything is going to be on the regular level, and then the bedrooms will be up top. But that is called a salt box house. Okay, and then in the middle Atlantic, so we're talking about the middle states, so New Jersey, New York, moving west as the people diffused to the what we call the I states. So Illinois, Indiana, Iowa. They created this, what a lot of people just referred to as a 4/4 house. And so you have the kind of the 4 windows over 4, and even though there's only 3 windows and a door, it's you kind of get the idea. And these, again, you can see that this house is made out of kind of like a stone material, and that's what the building material, they had a lot of stone around that area, and so that's what they used, and it made it very strong to the elements. If it was wind or cold, that stone stood up very well. All right, in the more towards the south, in what we call the Tidewater states, so these are areas on the Atlantic coast. So you want to kind of think like, oh, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, in this area along the coast. They had these kind of plantation style houses, and this one's kind of a medium sized one. But what I want to point out to you about this house is how it's kind of built up. And so you see that whereas the 4 over 4 is just right there at ground level, the one on the south is kind of built up. And that's typically to deal with tropical storms and hurricanes and things like that, where they could get some flooding, maybe flooding from a nearby river. And so they built their house up 4 or 5 feet, and that kind of protects them from flooding that could come so it doesn't destroy their house. Now, you can't see it on this house, but a lot of times southern houses will also have plantation shutters, and that is if they get a really strong, wind or tropical storm or even a hurricane, to the best that they can, they try to protect their windows and kind of close off their house to the elements. So that's something else we'd see in the South. Now, kind of an interesting little house, so this would be more for the low-income people, would be something called a shotgun house. And so the shotgun house is always characterized, it's really kind of small. It almost looks like a single wide trailer, but it's a house. But it's, it's for, like I said, for typically for low-income people. And it's, there would be doorways through. And the idea here is that in the South, where it's very hot, you would open up the front door and kind of open up the windows. And before the days of air conditioning, this is how you try to keep a house cool, was by opening the front, opening the middle doors in the back, and you just create kind of an airflow throughout the entire house as kind of like a wind tunnel. And so that's what the shotgun house is kind of this wind tunnel house to get a little flow of air in very hot and muggy conditions of the South. So we would see these in places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana and places like that. Now, for both, for both southern houses there, the Tidewater and Shotgun House, you can see that they have a front porch, and that's kind of an important cultural difference between northern people and southern people. Is that northern people a lot of times tend to hang out in the backyard, and they tend to have like a barbecue grill and things like that in the back, whereas southern people are front porch people. A lot of times they'll hang out in the front and attract others that come by, and to kind of whereas the northern people a lot of times came from cities and places like that where they kind of wanted to get away from society. The southern people that grew up in kind of isolation, they, if people came by, they wanted to see them, they wanted to come talk. You get the idea of southern hospitality. And a lot of that just kind of comes from their housing styles. Okay, and then the last one that you may need to know about is the adobe house in the Southwest. Here you can see, as opposed to, it's kind of like the opposite of the salt box house. Here everything is done to keep cool, so the material kind of reflects the sun. They're not really worried about rain or snow here, and so the roof is very flat. And a lot of times they would use the top of the roof to dry things, dry hides or chilies or something like that, where they needed to use the sun. And they weren't really worried about getting rain there at all. All right, so those are your major folk housing styles. Okay, we're now going to turn our attention to popular culture's threat to folk culture. And we're going to look at the different kind of ways that popular culture has crept into and threatened folk culture. And one of the big ways that it occurs is via the internet. And so as more people get access to things like news, social media, television, cable TV, even something as simple as a newspaper, they're going to see the outside world. They're going to be influenced by it. And, if they like what they see, then they're going to start adopting some of those things. And those are going to, threaten their way of life, threaten their way of their groups doing things. Hey, urbanization. Urbanization, remember, is kind of the opposite of, whereas a folk culture tends to be in a rural area, people tend to be kind of spread out and isolated. Urbanization brings people together. And so when you're closer together and you're around more people, you get exposed to ideas and things that you never really saw before. And this interaction, you start to get acculturation and assimilation in terms of cultural borrowing to some extent, where people see different ways that people do things, the way that they types of foods that they eat or music that they listen to, and they want to do the same things. And so that urbanization is going to kind of threaten that folk culture way of life. Now, popular culture for a lot of these people, tends to be a very attractive way of life. And, you think of like the Amish, and the Amish, one of their rigid things that they have done is that they've resisted technology. And so think about if you are an Amish kid and all of a sudden, you are exposed to an iPhone or a flat screen TV, and what you might be thinking the first time you saw this, like, wow, I'd like to have one of these things. And, that goes against their cultural fabric. And, so that kind of threatens their cultural values. And, movies and music and all of that stuff tends to be very attractive to the younger generation. And remember that, the adults in that folk culture are trying to get the young people to adhere to the culture that they've established. And when young people see these things and they're exposed to them, then they're like, I don't want to do that. I want these things. I want these new things that I'm seeing. And it threatens folk culture. Now, from a global perspective, what we have seen, because the United States and Great Britain, especially the UK, because we have dominated economically and militarily in the last 75 to 100 years, and really Britain, it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Because of that military and economic dominance, it has brought us technological dominance. And, we've really kind of controlled the business world to a large degree. And so people have been exposed a lot to the way that we dress and the music we listen to and the TV shows we watch. And that's been very attractive to them. And as a result, we've been huge exporters of our culture to the rest of the world. And, to some people, that's not like that big of a deal. But to those people trying to maintain a folk culture, it is. It's a threat to them. And so to kind of give you some examples of this, we're seeing like Saudi Arabia, where they've started to give women the right to vote, or they're thinking about it and giving people or giving women the right to drive and these kind of things, getting girls education. So one of the things that we're seeing is that the role of women worldwide are changing. And maybe to some degree, that's a good thing. It's going to bring down birth rates and things like that. It's going to make their country more productive. But again, that's kind of us telling them, hey, this is the way you need to do things. And maybe that's kind of threatening to their culture and their way of life. All right. And then we kind of talked about this with folk culture in terms of the minimal impact that a folk culture puts on the landscape, whereas popular culture is going to not just harm the landscape, the environment, but it's also going to lead to a lot of places looking the same. What I mean by that is, one time my wife and I, when we went for our honeymoon, we went down to Jamaica, and we got off the plane and we started driving in our car going to our hotel. And we went down the street, and it just looked like we were in America. Here I thought we were going to see all these Jamaican things, and yet I saw a Pizza Hut, I saw a Burger King, I saw a McDonald's. I'm like, hey, wait a minute, this is just like America. And so we call that idea placelessness. This idea that popular culture and our culture has run over, the other types of foods, the other types of music. And it becomes almost like we're just kind of one culture throughout the world. Okay, so we're going to focus on a couple of key terms while we have a little bit of time left. And so the first couple we're going to talk about are the differences between adaptive and maladaptive culture traits. Now, folk cultures, like we talked about with housing, tend to be adaptive. They don't modify their environment very much. They use the materials that are present in their environment. And so you can see like this Inuit Eskimo who is making an igloo because that's the materials that he has, and so he's not really modifying his earth a whole lot. He's just kind of, it's an think of it as like environmental determinism. Folk culture tends to be adaptive because they're very much determined by their environment. And so they have to kind of adapt to their environment to be able to live. And we talked about that with an adobe house. People are making their houses out of adobe, largely because it keeps them cool in a very hot environment. And, they don't need to worry about pitching the roofs because it rains very little. And so these are what we call adaptive culture traits. All right, so culture that is shaped by the surrounding environment. Whereas maladaptive, and this is what popular culture tends to be, that's a modifying culture, and so it's culture that's not shaped by its surrounding environment. And so, if you take a look at this picture inside, these people are living in a desert, but yet they're skiing. And so, it's a very possibilist idea. It's not determined by the environment, and so we say that folk culture tends to be adaptive, and popular culture tends to be maladaptive. And so, there's all sorts of different traits that we'll talk about in terms of adaptive versus maladaptive, but just kind of make that link in your notes that folk culture is adaptive and popular culture is maladaptive. Now, one of the biggest groups of people that are threatened by popular culture are what we call indigenous people. And indigenous people are the original inhabitants of a certain place. And they are one of the main sources of folk culture that exists in the world today. And every generation we're losing these people, or these people, even though they may not be like killed or anything, they may be assimilated into the more dominant culture. And so, like many of the Native Americans today, they may think their prospects are better to just go to college in America. And before a generation or two, all of a sudden you can't even hardly tell that these, that they're Native American, and they've lost a lot of their indigenous culture. And so when we take a look at like the Yanomamo here, you can see these people are very different from what we'd see in the United States. We don't have hairstyles like this, necklaces, the piercings, the tattoos on their face, whatever the case may be. These are things that would look very different from Americans. And these are the type of people who are the most threatened by popular culture coming into a place. Right. And here's a good example of that. Here you can see kind of the intermixing where these people are, acculturating over time, where they're gradually kind of gaining the culture traits of, industrialism, whereas the guy on the far left, he obviously is still very much an indigenous person, where his family members are starting to kind of convert over and starting to dress like a Westerner. And so they have these T-shirts that are made by industrial machines, and they are starting to look more like somebody that's living in modern world, as where the guy on the left, he looks like he's still living 400 or 500 years ago, and he's has very little clothing on because it's very hot in the jungle, and they don't have machines to make clothing made out of poly, like some sort of poly material or cotton or something like that would take way too long, and they don't even have that in their country. Okay, that is where we will cut off for today. And so in class, I will start with the idea of globalization, which also has to do kind of with popular culture. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in class this week.